Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar. It's nice to see you all here. So my name is Veit Schillinger. I work at United Nations University in Germany, and I'm coordinating the e-learning activities in the GlobeDrought project. And if you've been to one of our webinars before, you already know how it's going to work. I'm just going to give a very short introduction. So this is a monthly, or more or less monthly webinar series where we have both these webinars and also video lectures that you can find online on the learning management system. And so today we are going to talk about understanding and assessing risk of drought impacts. And we have 3 speakers today. So first, my colleague Michael will give a more theoretical introduction about the concepts and the relevance of assessing drought impacts. And then we will have 2 case studies. First by Isabel about the global scale assessment, and then by Veit Blauhut from the University of Freiburg about insights from the hydropower sector in southern Germany, in Baden-Württemberg. And then we will have a short synthesis and discussion of the content. And there you can actually contribute yourself through comments and questions, which you can either raise by typing down in the chat box if you have any questions you would like to ask the lecturers. Or you can also click the button to raise your hand, like this. And then we can actually let you speak through your microphone to ask whatever you want to know from our lecturers. And I would also like to invite you, if you have any questions during the presentations, you can just write them in the chat, and we will take them up at the end of the session. So I would just like to give the word to Michael Hagenlocher from United Nations University.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yannick. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are on the planet. To all of you, and many thanks for joining our webinar. My name is Michael Hagenlocher. I'm a senior researcher at United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security based in Bonn, Germany. And it's my real pleasure to welcome you together with my 2 co-hosts, Isabel Meza and Veit Blauhut from the University of Freiburg to our webinar today. In our webinar, we will aim to provide answers to the following key questions. First of all, we will look into why is it actually relevant to have a better understanding, but also more accurate and sound assessments of the risk of drought impacts at different scales for different sectors. Secondly, actually, when we talk about drought risk, so what do we really mean by it? How can we conceptualize drought risk and the risk of adverse impacts associated with droughts? What are relevant components, but also what are relevant factors and drivers that together co-produce and co-shape drought risk? And lastly, we'll look into what is the state of the science. So where do we stand in terms of understanding drought risk, but also in terms of assessing drought risk, drivers of drought risk, patterns of drought risk. And here I'm very glad that we actually have 2 different case studies. One that looks at drought risk for agricultural systems at the global scale, and a second one that looks more on water issues in a case study in southern Germany. And lastly, we would like to reflect a little bit based on these case studies, based on our own work, but also based on a very comprehensive review of the literature that we have conducted. We would like to reflect a little bit on where do we think are persisting gaps in terms of assessing risk, but also what could be potential future directions. And I would like to start with this short animation here. So here you can actually see agricultural drought hazard trends over the last 38 years, more precisely over the period from 1980 to 2018. And what you can very nicely see is actually that very large parts of the world have been affected by either mild and in some cases even extreme droughts over those 38 years, and very often leading to devastating but also cascading impacts on ecosystems, on livelihoods, notably those livelihoods that depend on water, like agriculture, but also many more like tourism and other sectors like the tourism sector or energy production, and in turn also affect entire economies. Maybe to quickly show you two examples. So the map that you see here actually shows drought conditions in 2018, and it very nicely actually shows also some of the major or severe drought events that we have seen in this year. Two examples that I would like to point out. One is the severe drought that has hit South Africa. Maybe many of you remember from the media, there was a lot of talk about day zero, so basically the day when municipal water supply would have to be cut down for the entire town of Cape Town. Unfortunately, the government and the authorities managed to avoid this very last minute. But what you can see in the table here, for example, is that compared to the full storage capacity of the dams in Western Cape, this drought has, for example, led to a reduction in the total storage to an amount of only 24% of the potential storage in those dams. So quite severe effects. In the same year, and this is maybe many of you who are from Europe might remember this quite well, we also had a quite severe drought event affecting Central Northern Europe, and next to affecting, for example, we are located right next to the Rhine, next to affecting, for example, riverine transportation in Central Europe. It also had quite a major effect on crop yields. So there's estimates by the European Commission that, for example, this 2018 drought event has led to a reduction in the main crop yields, for example, maize, of up to 50%, with quite some detrimental effect on farmers and the entire agricultural sector. Now, how does it look when we look into the future? What is the picture that we get? And here I want to quickly talk about droughts and climate change. Maybe many of you have followed the releases of the special reports of the IPCC in the last 2 years, and in 2018, a very interesting report was published by the IPCC that looked into how would the world look if we would have 1.5 degree warming in terms of global surface temperature. And the graph that you can see here shows the past warming trend and also the current warming rate if you follow a business as usual scenario with our lifestyle habits that we have in terms of traveling, maybe before COVID or after COVID. Let's see if we go back to normal in terms of heating, in terms of eating habits, in terms of transportation patterns, etc., etc. All of those habits being linked to greenhouse gas emissions and resulting in warming, and there's very convincing and striking evidence on those linkages, warming of the global surface temperature. And you can see that according to this business as usual scenario, we might end up at a global average warming of 1.5 degrees already in the period between 2037 and 2052, of course, with some uncertainty. But now the question is, what does that actually mean for droughts? And here I would like to refer to a concept that was put forward by the IPCC in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their third assessment report, which is called Burning Embers. And what this concept does, it basically looks at the key impacts that we, in this case, would see in a 1.5 degree warming world, or maybe even in a 2 degree scenario. So you can see the basically here, this gray line shows where we are today. 1.5 shows where we might be between let's say 37 and 2050 roughly. And it shows actually the implications of this global temperature increase on a number of what the IPCC calls reasons for concern. So you can see there's in total 5 reasons for concern. There's not enough time to go into all of them. The first one deals, for example, with unique and threatened systems. So this would be the effects, for example, temperature increases would have on coral reefs or on polar ice, on glaciers, on biodiversity. And I think all of this is quite self-explanatory. Maybe it's important to understand in order to interpret this graph that the darker purple the color in each of those bars, the higher the evidence and the more likely, the more severe the impact. And what I want to point out here is that, of course, if we have an increase in the global surface temperature, that this might also lead to an increase in the frequency and in the intensity of climate-related extreme weather events, including, amongst many others, also droughts. And against this background, against the background that we already in the past decades have seen quite major effects on many different sectors, on people, on health, but also on entire economies, as I detailed before. In very recent years, a number of international policy frameworks have been adopted by the international community, which actually have the overall aim to reduce current, but also to prevent future risk. And here I would like to just very briefly refer to 2 very important ones when talking about droughts and drought risk and drought impacts. The first one, which might be known to many of you, is the Sender Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was adopted in 2015 by 168 UN member states, and actually serves as something like a roadmap towards reaching this goal of reducing current and preventing future risk, with the overall aim to also build resilience to climate change and climate-related extreme events. And interestingly, priority 1 of the Sender Framework is understanding risk, despite several decades of risk research. And if you look at the linkages to risk assessment, it's stated quite explicitly that there is a need to understand, to assess, but also to monitor over time disaster risk in order to provide baselines for risk reduction, for resilience building, for adaptation planning. A second policy document, which is maybe a bit more targeted towards the drought community, was actually published quite recently in 2019 by the UNCCD, that looked at drought impacts and the role of vulnerability assessment. And here I want to quote from this report. They say if you want to manage drought risk effectively, and I think this is not only relevant for the management of droughts, but also when you think about adaptation planning, then it's of course important to understand what might the likely impacts be on the different sectors, but also who are the risk groups, and why are those groups or those sectors or specific countries particularly at risk. Now the question is, what does that actually mean? So what does assessing and understanding risk really mean? And in order to tackle this question, we have conducted a systematic review of peer-reviewed vulnerability and risk assessments back in early 2019. And we reviewed over 1,000 abstracts, and in the end, 105 peer-reviewed drought vulnerability and risk assessments using predefined search terms and using existing literature databases like Web of Science and Scopus. And there's 3 interesting findings that I want to briefly report or reflect upon here. The first one is actually, and this is not very surprising, is shown in this graph. It's just simply showing that we see a major increase in the number of risk assessments over the past years, especially since the Hyogo Framework for Action, the predecessor document of the Sender Framework, so also a roadmap for reducing risk has been published, and then even a sharper increase with the Sender Framework. Here, of course, with the interpretation, care has to be taken, because we know that there's a general trend that the number of scientific studies increase. The second one is maybe a bit more relevant to content-wise. and quite surprising findings. So we found that 64% of the studies that actually had drought risk or drought vulnerability assessment in the title or in the abstract and conducted such an assessment did not actually specify what kind of drought hazard they were looking at. And if you think about, for example, impacts on, and Isabel will talk about this a little bit later, if you think about, for example, understanding the risk of a drought impact on an irrigated system, it's of course important to know how much water you have in terms of surface water, for example. Whereas if you look at a rainfed system, it's important to look at deficiency in rainfall. And not specifying what kind of drought hazard you look at means that you are generating some uncertainty in your assessment, which could, if in the worst case, also lead to misleading policy messages or conclusions. Another interesting finding was that actually 42% of those 105 risk assessments that we reviewed did not provide a clear definition of risk. And this again is problematic when you think about that clear definitions are important for framing your study, but also for interpreting your study and for kind of ensuring that the findings can be used for action and to identify solutions. Now we looked at what kind of conceptual models are out there and quite heavily used in the drought community to explain impacts. And here I would like to refer to two of the most commonly used ones, one from the National Drought Mitigation Center on the left, and a more recent one, so this one is quite old already, but still quite heavily used. Another one, which is a bit more recent, published in Nature in 2016. And the interesting thing is that at the bottom you can see actually impacts of droughts, economic impacts, or social impacts, or environmental impacts, and this is pretty much the same in both frameworks. But what you can see is actually that both conceptual models try to explain those impacts by looking at the propagation of different droughts. So starting with climate variability, but then precipitation deficiency, soil water deficiency, reduced stream flow, and then in the end leading to impacts. But what is interesting when you look at this, and especially when you try to look at a couple of examples in recent years where we had severe drought events and impacts. So for example, if you look at South Africa and the severe droughts that we had over the last years, that it's not always the severity or the frequency or the duration of the drought hazard as such that explains those impacts, but it's often impacts are largely driven by the susceptibility of the people or the sector that is affected, and the capacity of those people or sectors to actually cope with a drought event shortly before, during, or after the drought actually happens. And this is what we mean when we talk about vulnerability. So an interesting thing here in those frameworks is that actually the notion of vulnerability is not very explicitly considered when trying to explain those impacts. So this is an important gap, we believe. And further, also the framework here actually talks about response options, but does not necessarily differentiate between options to mitigate climate change or coping solutions that people and different sectors might have, or what other risk transfer or adaptation options might help to reduce drought risk. And as a consequence, we have in the GlobeDrought project started to develop, and this is an ongoing development in the first draft, started to develop a novel framework that actually looks at the risk of adverse drought impacts in line with the latest definitions put forward by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So risk as a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. But also, for example, here in that hazard box, you can see that actually the drought propagation from climate change, natural variability, anthropogenic climate change, to precipitation deficiency, coupled with evapotranspiration, can lead to reduced soil and groundwater storage, but also reduced stream flow, and then you can have certain exposed elements. So for example, again, you will see in the example from Isabel for an agricultural system that could be people or cropland, in potentially drought-affected areas. And that, combined with the vulnerability of the system, then together explains the risk of the adverse impacts. And once this risk manifests, so when the three components come together, that's actually when we start seeing impacts. And here I would like to hand over to Isabel, who will give you a little bit of an overview of how she has assessed drought risk for agricultural systems at a global scale.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm Isabel Meza. I'm a research associate in the United Nations University, and I work within the GlobeDrought project. So I have the pleasure to present the first case study. It's a global scale drought risk assessment for agricultural systems. And first of all, I want to speak, Michael introduced a little bit, but why it's relevant to do drought risk assessment? And it is because, sorry, I need to click, yeah. It is because drought has impacts in ecosystems. In ecosystems, in communities, but also in entire economies. And when I speak about entire economies, it's not thinking just at national or subnational level. It also goes national boundaries, and it could be in regions. We select agriculture systems because it bears most of the impacts of drought, and also in many countries it's the most heavily affected sector. That's why we are doing this integrated assessment of drought risk at global scale for agricultural systems. But we don't go one step forward and now analyze also for the difference for irrigated and for rainfed. So in order to identify what are the relevant indicators to assess drought risk for agricultural systems, we did this literature review that Michael spoke before. And with these 105 papers, we identified 64 relevant 64 indicators. In order to know which indicators are relevant for agricultural systems at global scale, we run a global expert survey. This was a joint effort with the European Joint Research Center within the Global Drought Observatory. So these 64 indicators were weighted. We sent the survey for more than 120 experts, and in the final they identified 45 indicators for agricultural systems. So now that we identify these indicators, I will show you the workflow of the assessment. So here, as you can see, we are following the framework that Michael presented, which is based on the IPCC framework. As you can see here, we take into account the three components of risk: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And we have in the hazard and exposure the different irrigated and rainfed crops. And the vulnerability part, we are doing a social ecological systems perspective, taking into account the social ecological susceptibility and the lack of coping capacity. So for the hazard assessment and the exposure, so first for the hazard, we did a composite indicator. In the case of irrigated systems, we analyzed the accumulated stream flow deficit and the accumulated irrigation surplus. With this, we are aiming to have the water supply and water demand of irrigated systems, being the water supply, the stream flow, and the water demand, the irrigation requirements. For rainfed, we did a deviation ratio between the actual evapotranspiration, which is the evapotranspiration under actual soil moisture conditions, and the potential evapotranspiration. This is the water requirements of the crop without water limitations. And then for the exposed elements, we consider the crops. So the rainfed crops and irrigated. For this, we use a MIRCA 2000 dataset, which is composed for 120 different crops for rainfed and for irrigated systems. In the vulnerability part, we adapted the steps to do indexes by the OECD. So as Michael showed, we had our conceptual framework, then we identify the indicators through the systematic literature review and the expert consultation. Then we start to acquire all the data. We use only open data sources. And once we have our indicator sets and we found data, we start to do the data preprocessing. So we start to transform absolute values to relative, start identifying outliers, identify multicollinearities, and in the final, we got a set of vulnerability indicators. We got 26 indicators for the assessment out of the 45 that were identified. We normalized these indicators by min-max normalization, and then we did a weighted aggregation using the expert weights we got on the survey. So now I would like to show you the results we got. So first, I will show you for irrigated systems. As you can see in the top left, we have the hazard and exposure box. We did this together because, for instance, for irrigated systems, we consider irrigation requirements. And of course, in order to have the irrigation requirements, we need the irrigated crops. So it was linked. And in the top right, you will find the vulnerability. And then in the big map is the drought risk for irrigated systems with these three components combined. So for this, I want to show you a few examples. For instance, USA. As you can see here, it has a lot of heterogeneity within the country. And it's because this is a so big country with a lot of different climatic conditions that is affecting the hazard exposure values. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the tendency to dark red color is high values in any of the components, and the tendency to dark blue, it shows low values. So coming back to our example of USA, you can see it's tending more to high values of hazard exposure. But when we see the vulnerability part, we can see that it has low values, which in the final will be reflected in the final drought risk. We can also use an example, Portugal, which has high hazard exposure, but tending to low vulnerability, which it will reflect in medium final drought risk for irrigated systems. So please now keep with this image in your mind, because now I will jump to the rainfed systems so you can see the difference. And for the rainfed systems, we have the same hazard exposure, vulnerability, and then the combined. And for this one, I want you to see, for instance, Australia, which has tending to very high hazard exposure, but it has very low vulnerability. It means that it has very, very low social ecological susceptibility and high coping capacities. And this is reflected in the final drought risk. But when we see, for instance, Yemen, but that I hope is not too small for you, you can see it has medium hazard exposure levels, but very high vulnerability, which in the final is getting more tending to high final drought risk assessment. With this, you can see how relevant is the vulnerability in determining the drought risk. Now I would like to show you a final example. So we put together the rainfed and irrigated systems. And here you can see in this graph how it was performing the countries. And for this one, I would like to speak about Zimbabwe. This country, when we put together both systems, it was performing the highest. And also it had in hazard exposure, but also in vulnerability. And we wanted to see what are the key factors for Zimbabwe. And we found, for instance, for social ecological susceptibility, it was the low literacy rate and high soil and land degradation. And for coping capacity, they have low total renewable water. These indicators are making the vulnerability of Zimbabwe high, well, among others. But Zimbabwe is not the only one showing this, with these indicators, high vulnerability. We found also, for instance, Namibia having the same indicators, Botswana as well. So as a conclusion of all this, in the maps, as you saw, there are regions with low hazard and exposure for agricultural systems. These tends to be tropical and subarctic regions like northern parts of Latin America or Central Africa. In general, the countries with high drought risk, they also have high amount of exposed crops, like Zimbabwe. The high hazard variation in large countries, as we saw in USA, but also we have Brazil, India, China, is due to the very high variation in climatic conditions. As we saw, social ecological susceptibility and coping capacity are key in the level of drought risk, and to build resilience. We need to pay attention in indicators like soil degradation, land degradation, poverty levels of the country, and the total renewable water resources they have. And finally, drought risk assessments, they should be impact sector specific, but not just even in the same sector. As we saw here for agricultural systems, is the same sector, but we need to differentiate this sector. If we do the analysis for irrigated systems or for rainfed, we will have different results. And this is very relevant when we want to do drought risk management, because we can tailor a specific coping capacities and adaptation options in order to move forward to more agricultural resilient societies. And with this, I would like to pass to the second case study.
So now it's my pleasure. So my name is Veit Blauhut. I'm postdoctoral researcher at the University of Freiburg at the environmental hydro systems. And I will take you to different stories. So we now had to focus on the global scale. We go now more to a regional scale. I just have to find out how that works now. Yeah. Okay. So as you know, drought is propagating from meteorological to hydrological drought, and we're now focusing on hydrological drought risk. And I will give you some insights on the hydropower sector. But first of all, why does it matter? What you see here now is a query from the European Drought Impact Report Inventory, where we collect and categorize drought impact information that we find in the media. We categorize that to 15 different impact categories, from agriculture over freshwater agricultures to air quality and conflicts. Whatever comes up, we categorize it. As you see, the rings are on a different size. That's a bit biased by the way people report or countries report. What I want you to focus on are the different colors. Each color means a different impacted sector. And as you see, each country looks a little different. If you go for on the pan-European scale and we just mix it all up together, then you see that, of course, agriculture is probably the most dominant impacted sector. But we also have other sectors like public water supply, water qualities, or ecosystems. Today we want to focus on, or I want to focus on, energy and industry. Well, why that? When we are now all moving from the nuclear powers over to green energies, we have to consider our hydropower consumption or hydropower production. And so now going from an operator scale in Baden-Württemberg. Baden-Württemberg is a small county in the southwest of Germany, in the middle of Europe. And what we have over there is we have the nice, really beautiful Black Forest. So we have some high mountains, but we also do have the Rhine Valley. So we are supposed to be the water tower of Europe. What we also do have are other pretty important things like cuckoo clocks or nice weird hats and Porsche and Mercedes-Benz, but we also do have drought impacts, especially on hydropower. So why does it matter for us? As I already said, we want to move forward to the green energies, and in Baden-Württemberg there are no more chances to build new hydropower plants, so we have to think about how to improve the current state of hydropower plants. So when we talk about drought risk, we have to question who, where, to which extent, why, and how will the future look like. Of course, as always, you start with almost no data. You probably have lots of information on the hazard side, but if it comes to what are the actual impacts that did happen and what are vulnerability information, there's close to nothing. So what you most of the time have to start with is to collect informations. And for that, we did a very comprehensive online survey to each of the hydropower plant owners or operators and asked them about when did impacts happening, and we also asked why. So we collected vulnerability information. What do they think were the reasons? How do they run their hydropower plants? What are side factors? Do they have any adaptive capacities like drought management plans, for example? The other side, of course, you have like physical aspects, about the watersheds on hydrogeology, rainfall, water balances, etc. On the hazard side, of course, you have runoff at the gauges that are more or less close to the water power plants that we are hydropower plants that we were looking for. At the end, we want to all put it, or did it all put together in the drought risk formula. Drought risk, as already mentioned, is the likelihood of impact occurrence. And for the hydropower production here, it means that it's the deviation from normal. The normal is the average production over the years. And we want to do that, statistical tests, some regressions, etc. At the end, when we do have a nice formula, we want to see how the future might look like. And I will show that later. So, starting it up, these are all the hydropower plants that did reply, about 150. And on the upper right, you already see our very general formula. Drought risk is the deviation from normal, and it's a function of the density of water, is acceleration, degree of efficiency, drop height, and usable runoff. P is the power production at the end, and something is missing here. That will not show up. So the formula doesn't show up, I'm sorry. Anyway, so that's nothing really novel, but what we did, we used an hourly runoff and not the annual averages. And we also considered in and outlets between the gauges and the hydropower plants. We considered the environmental flow requirements, but also the maximum inlets to the power plant stations. At the end, we calculated the standard capacity. That's like the average annual power production. And the drought risk that we identified at the end is the deviation from this standard capacity. So how does that look like? At the end, you see a wealth of points that all indicate a different region within the county of Baden-Württemberg, but you see that it's fluctuating. And so we have drought years and we have more moist years, and that's what we wanted to see, of course, or what was kind of expected. On average, you now see that the most severe drought impacted year was 1971, 1976, and then later on 2003. That's a bit of contrary to the common media right now that say that the 2018 and 19 were kind of worse. Anyway, we could show that it already has been very severe as well. If you now want to look into a more detail on the spatial resolution and also the annual resolution, you see that there are certain areas where the drought risk or the losses on hydropower production were really high, and these are the regions of the upper Black Forest regions, but also in the south of Stuttgart. In comparison, in 2002, you see that the model is working kind of well, because in the moist years we have a higher amount of energy production, up to 80% more than on average. So now that we do know the impacts, or we can model the impacts of the hydropower production, we also want to understand, is there anything beyond the hazard that drives this drought risk? And therefore we did a vulnerability assessment. I already introduced our questionnaire, so we got lots of information. And then we used statistical tests like linear regression, ANOVA, and correlation to predict the driving forces of our losses at the end. And what came out is that especially the degree of expansion, but also the discharge variability are major drivers of the drought risk, so of the losses, of course, beyond the hazard. Furthermore, the climatic water balance within the watershed is very important, but also drought risk prevention measures that you see in the lower part of the table are influencing the losses. So with respect to drought risk management, we found certain points where we can work on it. For example, the discharge variability of streams, but also the degree of expansion and risk prevention. So we could improve the vulnerability. So if you present that on a map, you already can identify some hotspots of vulnerability. Again, that's again in the upper regions of the Black Forest, and that pretty well suits pretty well, of course, to our impacts. So if we now want to look for the future, we especially want to look for change in seasonality. Of course, there's a wealth of different future climate scenarios out there, but especially in the southern part of Germany, they are all kind of uncertain. That means that they're all predicting kind of different things. What they're agreeing on is that we will have a shift in seasonality, and that's why my colleague Michael Stötzer decided to create synthetic runoff scenarios where we redistribute the discharge from the 3 driest months in summer and autumn to the 3 wettest months in the winter and spring. And therefore, we have 6 runoff scenarios from 5 to 30% of runoff that we redistribute. And at the end, our change is the percentage of change to a synthetic standard capacity. And what you see at the end, we do have winner and losers. Of course, we wanted to ask, okay, why are there some winners and where are there losers? The winners are, now it comes, the high installed capacities and the power plants with a high degree of expansion. And the losers are the small hydropower plants with small installed capacities and small degrees of expansion. That's unfortunately kind of logic, because the losers from the summer can gain from winter extra flows and then on the average for the year can make more, produce more hydropower. So what we could learn from this small case study is that we do not have enough data. You should collect it. And there are a lot of ways to predict possible impacts. And if you want to go for drought risk management, you have to understand the vulnerabilities. And with that, I move on to Michael, who will conclude on the entire session.
Yeah, many thanks, Veit, and welcome back. Looking at the time, I think we spent a bit more time than initially planned talking about our case studies in the introduction. It's a complex topic, so probably we could also talk for much more time. But it's time to wrap it up. So we would like to conclude today by looking at 7 points where we think there are still persisting gaps, but that could also serve as the basis for future research. And there's already a lot going on in that direction. So the first point is on human-environmental interaction. And here I want to come back to the very seminal piece published by Anne van Loon in 2016, where it was in Nature, I think Geosciences, where she very convincingly made the argument that actually we need to look at human-environmental interaction when trying to understand droughts and drought propagation. But of course, this is not only relevant when looking at drought hazards, but it's also relevant when looking, for example, at drought vulnerability. So, for example, the case study that Isabel has presented, when you think about an agricultural system is by definition a closely coupled social ecological system where yields depend on soil conditions, but also human activities again have an impact on ecosystems and ecosystem services, which together influence vulnerability and risk. So looking at human environmental interaction is key, both in the drought propagation, but also in the drought vulnerability and risk assessments, and this is not consistently done or not very often done in assessments where those social ecological system coupling is actually of relevance. The second point is on, we had 2 case studies with different sectors, different contexts, different scales. And what our review has shown today, it was quite clear that there were different indicators were used to look at vulnerability, but often we found in our literature reviews, studies used actually very similar indicators, not being very sector or impact specific when trying to explain and assess vulnerability and risk. Veit has already mentioned data as a big issue, notably for the vulnerability components, but also impact data, very difficult to get, and even more difficult when you think about high spatio-temporal resolution, which is, of course, important if you want to have high granularity, but also want to look, for example, at trends and inferences that you can make from those trends. What we also found is that, for example, the work that Isabel has presented is pretty much a snapshot in time. I mean, it looked at 30 years of climate data, but then at a snapshot in time in terms of the exposure component, or a snapshot in terms of the vulnerability component. But of course, with global change, environmental change, societal transformation, all these components of risk, they change. There's more short-term changes. Think about seasonality aspects, for example, when assessing risk, but also more long-term changes. Think about climate change and again, societal transformation. So how will risk change in the future? What can we do about it in terms of human behavior, of risk reduction, of adaptation, and how would that affect future risk pathways? Here, there is very little work so far in that regard. Another important point is emerging risks, so not only looking at the known knowns, but also at the known unknowns. So here I'm looking at tipping points, for example, and how that could affect future risk trends. But also we know that drought risk can be quite systemic and cascading. Think about water, different water usages, and some of the conflicts there, and then some of the cascading effects that you could see, but also globally networked risks. So what happens if you actually have a drought happening in Latin America? How would that affect in a global production system, for example, farmers in Southern Africa? And how do we take that into account? Validation is an important point. So whenever we do risk assessments, we need to look into the sensitivity, the uncertainty, but also validate the outcomes against impact data ideally. So this speaks a little bit to the data point, but also the utility for action. So how useful are those risk assessments in the end to provide recommendations for action? And this is the last point. There could be many, many more, but this is science to action. So risk assessments should never be an end or an aim in itself, but they should actually aim to provide baselines for action. So entry points for risk reduction, for risk transfer, for example, where would an insurance mechanism work to transfer the risk from a farmer to an insurance, or to identify suitable adaptation options. And with this, I would like to close this synthesis and just would like to use the last minute before we go into the Q&A session to make two announcements. One, EGU this year will take place at the European Geophysical Union conference. Usually takes place in Vienna. This year, due to COVID, will take place virtually. And we're having a joint session there, drought vulnerability and impact assessments, achievements in future directions, with quite a large number still of contributions. And it's publicly available, unfortunately, only as a chat option. But we still thought it could be interesting for some of you. And then we wanted to point you to a report that is currently in the shaping and making by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. They have their biannual global assessment report, and now for the first time, a couple of people, including some of us, we're working on a special report on droughts, which is foreseen or planned to be launched in summer 2021. And we just wanted to give you that hint so that you stay tuned, and maybe the report will also provide some additional useful insights. So with this, I would like to thank you all for your attention and for being with us today, and also for being a little bit over time. I want to apologize for that, and we would like to use the last remaining maybe 15 minutes to go into your questions, and I hand back to Yannick for the moderation. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for the great presentations. So now, as I said in the beginning, we will have a short discussion. So you can still write your question in the chat. If you would like to speak directly, you can also raise your hand. We can unlock your microphone. I will just start with the questions we already have in the chat. So Martha asks about Isabel's study from this year, how the maps compare to the work of Cajao from 2016. What would you say, Isabel?
Yeah, well, we actually have two authors from the Cajao paper. They are also co-authors from our paper. And of course, we have some similarities. For instance, they use cropland as exposed element, and they also use agricultural land in the vulnerability. And we found for our map and their map, we found that the less affected regions of drought risk are the ones with low exposure of agricultural population or crops, for instance, desert or tropical forest areas. And also the places with the largest drought hazard we found is in the arid and semi-arid regions.
Right, thank you. I hope that answers your question, Marta. Nyalaji from Botswana asking about whether, or maybe working together to look at the drought management strategy for Botswana. It's not directly related to the webinar, but it sounds interesting. So does anybody want to respond to that?
Yes, I think I would just suggest that you have our contact details here on the last slide. I would generally encourage and invite all of you, should you have follow-up questions, should you be interested in having a follow-up conversation, or should you have ideas for potential collaboration or challenge some of the views that we put forward, then please get in touch, and we're looking forward to, of course, also hearing from you and interacting with you after this webinar. And this also, of course, includes the proposal to look at the drought plans. We are sitting in the same building as the UNCCD headquarters, so we're working on exchanging quite regularly with them. So yes, absolutely on that.
Thank you. And then Maria is asking about how do you measure the socio-ecological susceptibility of countries? I guess that's quite a complex question, but does anybody have a quick answer?
I could speak about the case in the global assessment, if that is fine. We did this review, so we identified the social ecological indicators, and then we asked the experts, so this is how we identify what are the relevant ones, and we separate them in social susceptibility and ecosystem susceptibility. So I can give you some examples. For social susceptibility, we use the share of GDP for agriculture, forestry, prevalence of conflict, insecurity, population using at least basic sanitation services. And for ecosystem susceptibility, we take into account the land degradation, the terrestrial and marine protected areas, average soil erosion, among others.
All right, thank you. And then there's another question related to your study, Isabel. Have you looked at the sensitivity of the vulnerability value to the 24 indicators in order to reduce indicators or data need? Question from Katrin.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. This is a very good question. The thing we did to validate our indicators was through experts, because we had first the 64 indicators, and we also thought in doing a statistical analysis for this indicator, like running PCA assessment, but then we decided to rely on what the experts said. And also we had before one paper that Michael made, doing this comparison between expert-based weighting and PCA or statistical approaches, and we found there is not a lot of difference. So yes, this is something lacking also in our paper, the validation of all the indicators, but we try to do it through experts.
Great. And then Marta has a follow-up question to the one about the Cacao map and your map. Those studies do not really quantify risk in US dollars, but that's often what policymakers are interested in. So how far are we from a global risk map expressed in average annual loss per sector? And she also writes, that is how to use all vulnerability indicators and translate them to the relation between impact in USD and vulnerability.
Yeah, maybe I can start and then Isabel can come in. It's a very good question. I would say that probably policymakers are not only interested in economic.
Okay, Michael turns off. So maybe I can follow up on that. So Marta, very good question. I guess it highly depends on the impact information that you do have a baseline. On, for especially example, the global scale, if you go for maize yields, for example, if you do have a very nice crop model, of course it's super easy to be linked to US dollars. That shouldn't be an issue. But if you go for different information like human health or environmental services, this is just not really quantifiable in US dollars, or at least very tough though. So it's So of course, the question of how to communicate that then to policymakers when you can't come up with dollars. Oh, Michael, you're back.
I'm back. Yes, thanks, Veit, for jumping in. And I think it's linked to also the availability of high-resolution impact data, because in order to come up with those relationships, we need to have this data available to first look into how does one specific factor, be the hazard frequency or the intensity or the exposure or the vulnerability factors, how do they actually explain those impacts? And this is one of the big challenges. Sorry for repetition if Veit has just mentioned that point. So I think this is why we also think that impact data is very important to have it collected and organized and made available at a high resolution to the public and to the scientific community, going beyond, for example, I mean, there's a very nice effort with the Sendai monitor, but this is not very high resolution. And then when you dig into, for example, countries, then it's often very difficult to get access to these data sets. And this is, of course, a prerequisite for developing such models.
All right. Thank you all. So if you have any more questions or comments or feedback, please leave them in the comments or in the chat, I mean. We still have maybe 5 more minutes. Okay, so now we have another question by Nialadzi. Is there easy to use indicators for field drought assessment by practitioners for timely policy and operational relevant assessment by field extension officers in the agricultural sector? Who would like to reply to this?
I mean, again, I can give it a start and then pass to my colleagues. I think what has become clear, although we only looked at 2 examples, and it would have become even more clear if we had more examples from different sectors and different scales, that a universal set of indicators does not exist. So we need, depending on the impact, the potential impact or the sector that we look at, the scale that we look at, the regional context that we look at, we need to think through thoroughly which hazard indicators would be most relevant in explaining those impacts, what are the exposed elements that should be considered when trying to explain the risk of those impacts. For agriculture, again, cropland, depending on the agricultural system, it could be also, if it's a pastoralist system, could also be livestock, etc., etc., and of course the set of vulnerability drivers. And here again, no universal set exists, but it's highly context specific. So good advice is to look at the literature, but also to consult with relevant stakeholders. And with relevant stakeholders, we definitely also mean the groups that are at risk should be considered in a very participatory way in such assessments as well. So no clear answer, but at least a process on how to identify potential.
I would add on Michael. So he, of course, brought it to the point. Bring impact information. So if you do not have data, get impact information, and based on impact information, you can also narrow the amount of vulnerability factors or information that you want to combine. If you do have some impact information, you could try to put some statistics on it. This impact information does not necessarily has to be yield statistics, but it can also be expert knowledge about past impacts. If you have this information, for example, then you can build on also statistically reliable models and have more numbers beyond your entire model.
All right. And I would like to thank everybody for your questions and for your input. And if there's nothing else, I think we can wrap up our session for today. And I would again like to thank our three presenters today, and everybody who joined us. And yeah, have a nice day, and maybe see you again in the next webinar. And also, if you haven't checked out yet, there's also an online lecture with Michael and Isabel. It's available on the learning platform about the same topic, but from like a different angle. Okay, then thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good day, evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.